Hi, I'm Karen Hurd, and welcome back to Asking for a Friend. Absolutely delighted today to be talking with Rita McGrath, who wrote a book called Seeing Around Corners. She has some tremendous research, and as you know, what I love, very practical approaches to think about what is happening next, inflection points. So, Rita, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. This has got to be the best show name ever.
It is so fun because most of these questions that I get are coming from our leadership programs, and we hand out these cards asking for friends because it's easier to ask for a friend than to ask your own leadership question. So we're talking about how do you think strategically when you don't know what's coming next, and gosh, we've all had a lot of that going on over the last couple of years. So I'd love just to start by when you say seeing around corners, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'm really talking about strategic inflection points, where an inflection point is something that creates a 10x shift in what you used to think was true about your situation. It could be your business, it could be your life, but it changes something by a factor of 10. So 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times nicer, 10 times more convenient. And the good news about strategic inflection points and what the book is really about is that when they happen, they feel as though they came out of nowhere, right? Like, oh my God, the pandemic, March of, with them that year. But when you look at them, right, there are always these weak signals that appear earlier. And so the inspiration for the book really came from the Hemingway line, right, in The Sun Also Rises, when one character asks another, so how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was, well, two ways, gradually and then suddenly.
Yes, absolutely. And, it's interesting. I was working with a client preparing for a keynote we were doing with them, and they said they had 4 strategigic pillars of things they're working on. And one of them was seeing around corners.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Love
Yeah.
it.
So, as I was reading your book and thinking about the concepts, one of the elements that really resonated with me was this concept of snow melting from the edges. And when we talk about snow melting from the edges, what does that mean?
Well, that was inspired by Andy Grove, who wrote actually the original book on strategic inflection points back in the 90s. And he called it Only the Paranoid Survive. You may remember that. And what he talked about was, he said, if you wish to see where spring is making itself felt, you must travel to the periphery because that's where the snow is most exposed. And the organizational analog is, big changes that are in progress don't present themselves neatly wrapped in a bow at your corporate conference table, right? They appear out on a loading dock where somebody's going, well, that's weird. I never saw a shipment from that supplier before. Or it's somebody on a customer service line saying, nobody ever asked me that before. So it's these weak signals that appear out at the edges of your organization. And so one of the things I think leaders need to be smart about is, how do I create those communication flows so that I'm actually plugged into what's going on? Because a sad fact of leadership is the more senior you get, and I'm sure you see this all the time, the more senior you get, the more insulated you are from what's really going on, right? And your days are just filled with, unless you take charge of it, right? Your days are filled with meetings and scheduling stuff and reviews, and you just don't ever get out to the edges to see what's really going on.
Yes, that's really what inspired our research in our book on courageous cultures. And we found that 49% of employees said they're not regularly asked for their ideas. So you've got snow melting and people see it, but if they're not proactively asked, it's unlikely they're just going to raise their hand and say, this feels funny to me. But if you go out and say, what is one thing that you're noticing here that's different now, right? That's that proactive.
Yeah, I mean, a really interesting best practice was when A.G. Lafley was the CEO of Procter and Gamble. Now, I mean, this is like a huge, huge company, one of the biggest in the world. And he would, every region, of course, wanted him to visit. And his condition for visiting a region was they had to arrange one visit to a store so he could look at how P&G products were displayed in that region. And they had to arrange a visit to a family or a consumer or, customers in their own homes. And he did that rigorously every time he visited anywhere. And the message to the organization was pretty clear. Look, I'm the CEO. If I can make time for this, you can make time for this.
And you share a very scary example in your book of a telecom provider who you want to share that what they were doing to kind of game the score on their executive visits?
Oh, sure. So this was actually years ago. It was T-Mobile, and
Okay.
I can. It's public, so I can talk about it. And this was back in the day when the T-Mobile network was widely regarded as like the worst in the country. Right? It was very spotty, and it was in the early days of wireless. And I happened to have one of these engineers from T-Mobile in my class, and he was telling me, "Oh yeah, we're going to have a visit from Deutsche Telekom, which was the owner of the company, and he's going to be in town for a week, and I got to get ready for that, and blah blah blah." And I said, "Well, like when this guy comes, isn't he going to find out how bad your network is?" I might have used a ruder word, but anyway, isn't he going to find this out? And he looks at me, he says, "Oh no, no, no. We know all his meetings. We know where he's going to be. We know how he's going to get from place to place, and we make sure the signals he gets are great."
That one made my stomach hurt because I was at Verizon for 20 years. I was like, oh no, that is a problem.
And here's the thing, though. I mean, and the reason I can talk about it publicly is nobody meant badly. I mean, the
Right.
guy thought he was doing a good job making sure his executive could function effectively in
Yeah.
this environment, right? So in his mind, he was doing a good thing, right? And you see this all over, car company executives that get given a fresh, clean car that's fueled for them every 6 months. Like they don't understand what it's like to have to go to a showroom or go to a gas station or, do any of those things. And it creates these incredible blind spots.
Yeah. And I was as I was reading about the snow melting from the edges, I was thinking about the importance of also really listening to your customers
Mhm.
as part of that. And we had an experience. So, we before the pandemic, most of the programs that we did were all in person. Occasionally this or that, but mostly in person. And we had head of HR call us from TELUS International, and she said, Karen and David, I would love to hire you, but here's my problem. I'm in 6 countries. I can't possibly afford to fly you all over the world all year long, right? And you don't have time for that. So what can we do live online? How can we create the best live online experience? I would have pulled together cohorts of international, so people will be in the Philippines and Las Vegas and on the same training with you. How can you make that fantastic? And so we're like, how do we do that? And so we spent a lot of time really designing this new approach. Thank goodness. Right. So when the pandemic hit and everyone said, we're going to have to cancel your programs, we said, actually, we have been doing this for 2 years with TELUS. Let us show you what we've been doing. I am so grateful to Michelle Braden of TELUS for having us do that. And now we're doing work with her at WEX. It's just completely changed our approach. So we got ahead of an inflection, but I don't think we would have done that. We would have seen that coming without
Mhm.
her.
Well, and I don't think a lot of us, saw it coming. I mean, we at Columbia Business School, which is where I teach, we dabbled, in online and live online and so forth. And so we had seeded some options, if you want to think about it that way, but we didn't really devote ourselves to it with the kind of energy we had to, because we, like we were looking at an entire year's worth of in-person revenue just evaporating overnight.
Mhm.
And it was interesting because it forced a lot of creativity
Yeah.
on the part, even of the university.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing that I thought was so many things were interesting, but another thing that really resonated for me was, when we tend to think about things in our industry, when we're looking to try to see around the corners, we're thinking about our industry. Where is our industry headed? You go to association conference, that's what people are talking about. And what might disrupt you could be from a different industry. And so how do you create that peripheral vision?
Mhm.
And you give the example of, and I'll use this because cell phones, because of my Verizon background, and how cell phones disrupted a whole bunch of other
Mhm.
industries.
Mhm.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, so I'll talk about the tech first, and then get onto the behaviors, because I think that's really interesting. So if you think about your modern day cell phone, right? It's a flashlight, it's a camera, it's a video recorder. I mean, there is like a mountain of stuff that you no longer have to have once you have one of these devices in your pocket. So that's just amazing. But the behavioral one, I think, is even more interesting. Um, and it gets to a theory that I borrow from Tony Ulwick and Clayton Christensen, and it's called jobs to be done theory. And the jobs to be done theory says, don't think about customers buying your product or service. Think about them hiring it to get jobs done in their lives, right? And I think that's just such an interesting twist on how you think about customers. So think about jobs to be done and think about clothing. And what's the job that clothing has to do for teenagers? Let's just say. And I mean, if you think about it, teenagers, clothing's all about communication. What tribe do I belong to? What tribe do I not belong to? What kind of person am I, right? And then starting in about 2003, cameras started to become incorporated into cell phones. And, even back then, the old flip phones, right, there were cameras in them. And so what were teenagers doing? They were taking selfies, right, of each other and sending them around. And so now these two things start to intersect, right? Because I send somebody a picture on Tuesday and I'm in a pink jacket, and I'm doing something cool on Thursday and I'm in the same pink jacket and I'm at a party on the weekend. And, how lame is that? And so what I want, right, is I want kind of disposable clothing. And I would argue that this whole movement towards fast fashion, which companies like Inditex, which own Zara, and H&M and various other, mass market merchandisers have capitalized on, really is driven in large part by this need teenagers have to sort of communicate who they are to each other with this technology layer now on top of it.
Yeah. So, and you were mentioning they have the technology layer, and they also don't have as much discretionary income because they're spending you're 15 years old, you don't have a ton of money, but what is the most important thing for you? It's a good phone.
Oh, yeah.
So now they're all thrifting too, right? And that whole thing has come up. And I was thinking about if I had been, in the camera industry when that time came,
Mm-hmm.
and I was a bit of a snob because I am a photographer, right? So I would carry around this thing. And my friends would be using phones. And I was like, yeah, well, that's nice, but that's because you're not a photographer. But I never thought, I just went on vacation. This thing is gathering dust because these phones are so good at it now. But I think that, so that's the kind of thing you talk about. When is the right time for the disruption? Because right as the technology is starting to evolve, it might seem like it's not going to be a big deal, but it could be.
Well, you need to really understand the jobs, right? And if you think about the jobs, not for a professional photographer, but for a typical consumer, right? Yeah. What have you done for decades? You take a picture, you get it developed in some way that you can look at it, and then you either put it in an album if you really care about it, or you put it in a shoebox, right? We have the exact same behavior today. The job's the same. I want to take an image, I want to capture it, and now I've added on a layer of, and I also want to be able to share it, which a physical picture isn't very good at. So that's, I would argue, when you had the transition, when sharing now became not an album-based in-person thing, but I can share it via text, I can share it via Instagram, I can share it via Facebook, and that now becomes what you want to do with your images.
Yeah. So I know that we have a lot of people who will be watching this who are say this is very interesting, but I'm not the CEO. And so how can I apply this concept of thinking strategically, seeing around corners if I am a manager or a supervisor?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things I've been suggesting to people, and, we have a tremendous problem with burnout and stress and people feeling, that they're unable to exercise agency at work. And my advice to people is don't accept that as your fate, right? You have small things you can do wherever you are in the organization. So my suggestion is go out and find some like-minded souls who are interested in an issue. Like, let's say it's, I wonder what 3D printing is going to do to my little ball bearings business, right? And, find 5 or 6 people that you could kind of create a little community with, have them work with you on maybe coming up with some solutions, some suggestions, some whatever. And you can kind of gain your own sense of agency wherever you are. Your sense of control, your sense of having a controllable, useful output. So I think organizationally, that's one that I would look at. But personally, right, I think you really need to be thinking about inflection points in your own life, because these days of a career ladder, they're gone, right? And today it's all about career zigzags. It's all about what's next. Hierarchies are flattening. So thinking of your career in terms of what's the next step up, some kind of hierarchy, that's not working anymore. And instead, what we're seeing is people are developing by creating new skills, creating new networks, creating new places where they can add value. And that's really how you grow in a professional sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's interesting. We were doing some work at Texas Christian University, and it was for the faculty and staff who was in the room. And a lot of people were individual contributors. So we weren't talking with the dean, and in just 40 minutes. So they had this massive housing problem because, right, the university has gained in popularity, and now they didn't have enough housing, and so uh, somebody said, well, what about a tiny house? What if we started using tiny houses?
Mhm.
And that was a really brilliant idea in a very short period of time, because you can do that quickly. It doesn't take as much time to
Exactly.
put up a community of tiny houses.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got Dave, Mustafa, and then David. Love to hear your questions. It looks like we do have one from David. And this is so David is my co-author and business partner. And this is a tension that we have personally all the time. So my role is really to be looking out and forward, and he's doing such an incredibly good job with operations. And sometimes that creates massive conflict because because so how would you respond to this question? What advice do you have for us?
Well, I like to think about things in terms of different levels of uncertainty, right? So if you think about uncertainty about what markets you might serve and uncertainty about what technologies you might be using, um, when uncertainty is low on both dimensions, that's like your operations today, right? That's your core activity, right? And you can take this as a company, you can take this as a person. Moving out a level of uncertainty, you've got, say, new platforms that you want to build. And your example of learning to do development virtually would be a case in point, right? It's a big new addition to your core business. Now, on the high uncertainty dimension, what you've got are options that you're placing for the future. And again, personally or business wise. So as a person deciding to take a course, deciding to, maybe take a trip to somewhere where you've never been, going to an industry association that's not your own industry to see what's going on, like in somewhere that's different. These are all options. And options is a very intuitive idea, right? You send your kids to college, you don't do a return on investment calculation for what they're going to learn, but you know that if you don't do that, there are many opportunities that aren't open to them. So what I recommend there is figure out how much of what kind of activity your strategy requires, and then figure out how much time you're going to put into each of those buckets. So how much time for the core, because that's job one, right? If you don't do that well, everything else, you can't afford it. But then how much time to develop these new platforms? And then let's give ourselves some Play-Doh money, right? That we could use to experiment with some options. So building a new skill, taking a new class, learning something that's new and different. As an individual, these are all options that create future possibilities for you.
I love the way I love thinking about that way, bucketing that, and so that you've got your core business going, and you talk about making little bets.
Mhm.
And I'm a big believer in pilots, and these little bets sometimes, I think where people get stuck is they get too attached.
Yes.
Yeah. So you speak to that a good bit in the book too. You want to talk a little bit more
Sure.
about that? Yeah.
So this really gets to a concept I call being discovery driven, which is, I think there's this huge opportunity. I'll make this up: 3D printing and, the ball bearings. And I think it's a $50 billion opportunity. Let's just say I'm willing to spend $25,000 to figure out if maybe that's right or not. So that 25,000, that's like your option money. That's like the money you can afford to lose. It's just like your stock market portfolio, right? It's, you want a small amount, not a lot, and you don't want to put the house at risk, but a small amount of money that's there to see if this is a real thing. Then what you want to do is organize your journey on the basis of what I call key checkpoints, where a checkpoint is a moment in time or a set of events that are going to really teach you something. So typical checkpoints would be, we'll do some customer interviews. Maybe we'll create a prototype. Maybe we'll find out that the prototype didn't work and we'll learn from a different prototype. Maybe we'll think about our ecosystem strategy, So each of these checkpoints has a time, right? It's got a budget that you're going to get to beat to it. And then as you get to a checkpoint, here's the discipline, right? You want to do what I call race, which is ask these questions. Should we redirect? Right? Should we accelerate? Maybe we've learned that we need to move faster. Should we just continue, or should we exit? So it's race. Should we stop? And I think what people fail to do is they make the decision to move forward, and then they never go back and check their assumptions, right? And now, like, an interesting example that happened just this morning was CNN just announced they're stopping CNN Plus
Saw that.
after hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. And my pitch is always like I don't mind stopping things when it's like a few 100,000, but when you spent hundreds of millions to discover this isn't going to work, that to me says you're not planning your uncertainty management process right.
Good, good. Well, Jared is reminding me that I forgot to ask you the question that I've asked every single guest. So thank you, Jared. It's been a long and challenging few years. What has been a source of strength for you during this time?
Oh, how people have really rallied around each other and supported each other and come together. I think that has been wonderful. In my world, seeing how much people are really willing to invest in their own development, even amidst all the chaos, people are still, investing in courses, investing in books, investing in reading. And I also belong to a number of communities that I think are very supportive. So an example would be the Silicon Guild, which is a group of authors who write nonfiction work that we really support each other. So if somebody's launching a book, everybody kind of comes together. And I think those sources of communities and strength are really important.
Nice. That's all lovely. Well, thank you for sharing that. So what have I not asked you about that I should have, that, advice that you'd like to leave people with?
Well, I think the first piece of advice I would have for anybody is don't be paralyzed by uncertainty, right? The fact that it's uncertain doesn't mean you wait indefinitely to find out what happens. What you want to do is start taking action in a small way, right? And when you say, this is what I believe, right? You take an action to test that hypothesis, you'll get some kind of result, and that will teach you something. So be in motion a bit, don't expose yourself to massive risk, but be in motion. Now, for leaders, there's something I think you can do for your people that we don't talk about enough, which is absorb that uncertainty for them. Tell them, what are the assumptions we're working on today? It may change by next week, but for this week, you can assume the following, right? And what that does is it frees people up. And I often hear leaders say to me, well, I don't know what the right answer is. And I'm like, no, but you're in the best position to be wrong, right? If you say to somebody, hey, Joe, what do you project this is going to be? And Joe's like 2 levels down from you. Joe's terrified, right? So you absorb the uncertainty for your people, and it will free energy up in your organization.
Yes, I have seen that again and again and again over the last 2 years. And, part of one of the things that we say is not everything is uncertain.
No.
So what you need to do this week.
Mhm.
So if you can just, worry about these things, ask strategic question, get their input. But meantime, make sure they know what to do this week. And because it's exhausting to think about that.
Oh,
everything is.
It is. I mean, I do think a lot of people are really more tired than they're willing to acknowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I really appreciate you being here, and tell us where can people learn more about you and your important work?
Well, a good place to start is my website, which is ritamcgrath.com, very imaginatively named. I publish a weekly newsletter, which comes out on LinkedIn and on Substack, and it gets repurposed on Medium, and the archive is up on my website. So that's a good place to begin. I've also got a tools company called Valize, which is VALIZE.com. And we're busy building tools that take some of these great ideas into action.
Nice, nice. Well, I really appreciate all of your insights. Thanks for taking the time to be on
Okay.
Asking for a Friend.
Hey, thanks.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we have a very special underwater edition of Asking for a Friend. Literally underwater. Not going to tell you any more about that until next time. Hope you'll tune in.